Hello and welcome to this week's HealthTech Hour on UK Health Radio with me, Steve Roest. Each week we bring you the best news, views and interviews with the leaders, clinicians, CEOs and today investors that are changing the face of healthcare in the UK and beyond. As regular listeners know, I'm the CEO and founder of a health tech company myself called PocDoc. We have developed a range of smartphone-based blood tests and currently rolling out across the country. Thank you very much to PocDoc for the support of the show. If you want more info, head to mypocdoc.co.uk. I'd also like, as ever, at the top of the show to say thank you very much to UK Health Radio and to everyone listening live on UK Health Radio. Also, quick shout out, UK Health Radio, all of the shows on UK Health Radio are now available in podcast form on Spotify, which you can check out if you want to, not just this show. I would also say thank you if anyone's listening to our show on Spotify or watching it after the fact on YouTube, or in fact, any of the other podcast channels. We're up there. So our numbers on podcasts are going up and up and up, which is great. So thank you very much. Now, today's show, as I said, we have a leader from the investment community. So investment community being the companies and funds that invest in companies that then do stuff to make us healthier or to improve everyone's life or to, allow us to order a takeaway at like 1 o'clock in the morning, whatever it is. That's what the investment community is. So this week we have Lina Zakarauskaite. I think I did that okay. Who's the principal investor at Stride VC. So Stride VC are one of the most dynamic early stage VC funds in Europe at the moment. They were kind of put together by one of the veterans of the venture capital space, a guy called Fred Destin, who back in the day was one of the founding partners of a thing called Atlas, which funded kind of like some of the biggest names that now seem like really old school traditional companies, but at the time they were kind of groundbreaking. So anyway, Stride have backed a ton of companies, some of which I'm sure you'll know, like Deliveroo, for example. But the reason why Lina's on the show today is to talk about what they're doing in health, why that's interesting to them. So Lina, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Good. So your background wasn't necessarily I know that you worked at somewhere called Secret Escapes, but you actually started life as a scientist. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes.
What type of scientist?
Yes, my journey into tech has been a little unconventional. My academic background is in neuroscience and pharmacology. I've always loved natural sciences. And that was, the space I gravitated towards. But fun enough, quickly into my studies, I realized the life of academia is not necessarily the pace, is not necessarily my cup of tea.
What do you mean? I don't understand what you mean, Lina.
Yeah, that did happen. And so then it was, a journey of trying to break into tech. Right, okay. With a different background.
But did you come into tech wanting to do like health tech or just any tech?
It was back at the time. It was sort of the London tech ecosystem was buzzing, and there were so many interesting projects popping up. And I, being a very naive, scientist from a completely different field, I was just attracted to the energy and the pace and of the tech ecosystem, of the startup ecosystem, and so it really was about trying to find my way into this world of startups.
How did it go? Like, was it easy, tough, hard? Like, what? I mean,
how do you think it went?
I don't know. I mean, I left university and kind of got myself after sort of 2 or 3 years in advertising where, I don't think advertising and I got on all that well. I think it was like a mutual feeling, to be honest with you. I'm not sure the industry was too sad to see me go. And I certainly wasn't too sad to see the back of the industry. I found it, I know lots of my friends, from what worked in technology and tech companies. And I got really lucky with where I ended up. But I know some of the people found it kind of tough, like if you land somewhere and it doesn't work out and then you go somewhere else, it doesn't work out, it can feel like pretty tough. But I certainly agree that there was, I guess this was probably at like the late 2000s, early 2010s, stuff like that. The buzz around London was something pretty special.
Yeah. It really was about, I believe in serendipity. I believe in engineered serendipity as
Like you make your own luck.
Exactly. And so it really was a path of a lot of no's, a lot of dead ends, a lot of conversations that don't go anywhere. And people look at you and, they're like, what do you mean you want to go into tech? Like, you don't have an MBA? And, like...
People actually say that to you. They say that to you about not having an MBA. I think that is a negative predictor of success in tech.
That is an interesting point. But yeah, I eventually bumped into this program called New Entrepreneurs Foundation in London. And NEF, as we call it, it really was my MBA, if you like. Right. So it was this one year long program, which gave me the knowledge, because frankly, I knew nothing about entrepreneurship at that point. It gave me the skills and it gave me the networks to find my way, to break into tech. And so that's how I joined Secret Escapes.
So did you choose like Secret Escape? Like, actually, for everyone listening that doesn't know, how would you describe Secret Escapes?
Secret Escapes is a global travel brand that connects luxury travel for less, basically, in a marketplace model. So it really is about, if you imagine beautiful infinity pools that we all dream of being in right now.
I'd love to be in. No, I mean, I guess after speaking to you, my next would be the infinity pool.
Yes, check them out. It's luxury travel for less, right? And it really was at the time a notable startup. It was we just did our series. We just did a Series D by Index, and there was a lot of excitement of going into new markets and launching new products, and it was just this perfect springboard for me into a high-paced, high-growth environment where everyone was so hungry, and so kind of the sense of urgency was so strong, and the contrast to my life, before. I loved it.
And how long were you there for?
So it was a 1 year long placement that turned into an amazing 4 years, because I loved it so much. I didn't want to leave.
And also, presumably, they kept you on, which is always a good sign.
I joined as a generalist in marketing, so working directly with the CMO for sort of, I think at the time it was 50 people org or so in the marketing, so across brand, performance, and CRM. And I had a very fancy title, special projects.
Oh, more like special operations, like
special operations, yeah. Okay. Which was, fascinating in itself. But, one project grew into more initiatives, more sort of cross-department collaboration. I guess you could call it entrepreneur in residence. That's another sort of title people use for this type of...
That's a very fancy title. I always like seeing that, entrepreneur in residence.
Yeah, exactly. And so I kind of expanded more into product, tech, strategy, at the end of the day, becoming the head of growth for the business. So incredible, like really, really interesting projects, pushing the boundaries, making bets in an organization that at the time, was big. Like it was, and kind of finding our way back to quick iteration cycles, operating again like a small lean startup. It was fascinating. I loved it.
So why not stay, or why not go to another company? What was the move to VC or venture capital to go and be an investor?
You will see a pattern here. Every 4 or 5 years or so, there's a bit of
bit of a move.
I don't want to call it existential crisis, but there's something in me that I love wearing many different hats, and I love connecting the dots. And so I think that makes me a sort of a true journalist at heart, I guess. And so I was ready. I was ready for my next adventure, and I remember coming up to, the team at Secret Escapes, and now in retrospect, I'm like, wow, I was a little crazy. At the time, it felt so natural. And, I asked them, I said, hey guys, I loved it here. It's time for me to move on. Help me find my next thing.
Okay, nice.
And we did. And we
I
did.
love that. Yeah, I want to leave, and can you help me find the next topic?
Right. It's like in dating, help me find my next boyfriend.
Yeah.
But yeah, and Fred Destin, he did a seed round back in the day into Secret Escapes. So Tom, the founder, and himself knew that each other really well, and I think from the first moment I met Fred, I was like, wow, for the first time, it's the VC that we actually speak the same language. Because I was an operator, like I was not an investor, so
Yeah.
that really, really resonated with me.
And how have you found it? Like, what are the biggest differences so far that you've kind of come across, you think?
It's an interesting feeling. It's been 18 months now since I joined the dark side of venture. That sort of deja vu when it's the moment where you feel like it's a similar type of puzzle pieces, but you're just looking at it from a different angle. So it's the constant sort of known and unknown, novelty mixed with, sort of stability and things that you're familiar with. So it's a very interesting transition in many ways, both professionally, but also on a sort of personal level. And I think it's interesting, right? Because back at Secret Escapes, my role has always been cross-functional. So growth by design, right? It is multidisciplinary. There isn't a single sort of, you need to pull in marketing, you need to pull in a brand when needed, product, tech, commercial, sales, etc. So I thought I can operate in ambiguity and, big problem, multifaceted problem sets. But man, little did I know that in early stage venture, in a generalist fund, that's like the next level. So it's definitely been interesting.
Well, also, the timing is kind of amazing, right? The last 12 to 18 months of the financial situation. So that was going to be one of my questions, which is like, where's all the money gone? I mean, where's it gone, Lina? Where's the money gone?
It's it's incredible that I think you can never get bored in this job because there's macro cycles, right? There's macro kind of environment around you, and things change so fast, as we have seen. And so, like this time last year, the ambiance was so different in the ecosystem versus today, where we are today. And it's interesting to be in it and to watch it. But also, in many ways, it's interesting to see how different funds adapt and adjust. And we are in a long game, right? Remember, this is not like high frequency trading or something. Like, it is long-term projects. That's the nature of the business. And so these sort of cycles, and we've seen so many micro cycles in crypto, for example. I'm sure
crypto is its own, that's kind of a whole separate kind of maelstrom of
exactly.
Exactly.
So it's really interesting to see how much is about at early stage, especially when there's no data, right? Or very little data, or it's very noisy. And so is it really statistically significant? Those cohort numbers you have, like, there's so much about the kind of the belief in the founding team and in the big vision. And price, I mean, of course it's being adjusted, but we are in early stage, so it's still very much, game on.
Right. But so it's not like, because it's definitely, I think we're at like the lowest level of VC investment, particularly in health, for quite a while. I mean, it's definitely dropped off. Is it that the money's still there and it's just not being invested, or the money's like gone somewhere else, it's moved to another sector, or like, what's your view?
I think, if we look at 2021, the first half of 2022 for health tech in particular, it's been great, right? A lot of great companies were back. There was so much, of course, the COVID crisis and all the sort of acceleration of, finally digitalizing healthcare. And, it's been great. I think, as you say, this year is challenging, for every field. I don't think health, if something, probably health, it's one of those somewhat, I guess, crisis proof industries where we're always going to need to go to a GP, right? It's not a sort of a fancy I don't know, luxury holiday for that regard. And so I still think there's a lot of interesting projects in the space. There's a lot of great founders who have this long-term mission of solving great problems and helping patients and helping the systems, and so it's still very much, it's definitely harder though. Deals are taking longer, investors are taking their time doing the due diligence. So if you're a founder in the space, I mean, it's interesting to hear your point of view. We've talked earlier about your journey, but it's I think there's definitely a readjustment needed in terms of expectations and frankly cash flow management, just because things take longer.
Yeah, I definitely would agree. I mean, it's a completely different market from, even like 7 or 8 months ago to now. And what I find interesting, like to your point, is that, so like to your point around, if I was in a luxury high end something startup, right, that was reliant on, large numbers of customers spending volume of discretionary income on something that was relatively non-essential and not unique. So not necessarily, like, I still think people are going to spend money on front row seats to Beyonce, for example, which is why ticket resale, ticket marketplaces, event-driven things are still very, very popular, right? Like, for example, the average price for a Super Bowl ticket, this is the highest it's ever been now, the trading data. So for the one that's coming up this weekend or next weekend or whenever it is. So I think that's all fine. What I find interesting is, like, in health, like you say, even the short, medium, or long-term trend data is that there are effectively more customers, i.e., more healthcare organizations need more help, i.e., they're spending more money with companies on their goods or services or so on. So the actual pull factors are increasing, but actually there's been this kind of funding crunch, if you like. So, for example, if you were in a sector that was booming, in theory, the companies in it would find it easier to raise money, but for some reason I don't necessarily see that trends through health. And I just wonder whether it's because so much of the spending comes from customers that are considered to be difficult, like the NHS or like these larger healthcare organizations. It's not the same way as, like, okay, I understand if you put £10,000 a month on Google PPC, I can kind of understand your metrics and your LTV and your customer acquisition and things like that. Whereas, like, healthcare is a little bit different if your customers are these larger organizations. But I don't know what you think.
I think you touched upon a really interesting point, NHS. Like, in so many ways, we are so privileged in this country because it's such a great innovation bed for testing out new ideas. It really is a world leader, actually, on a global scale.
Yeah.
But when it comes to a certain level of sort of moving beyond, a few trusts and actually achieving certain scale, it's challenging.
Yeah. Well, so I think, like, what's really interesting, and to the extent that anyone listening knows this, I apologize for going over ground you already know, but I'm assuming a lot of people probably don't. But, correct me if I'm wrong, but, like, generally speaking, the venture community, so to speak, doesn't, as this is the UK only, doesn't necessarily place a lot of value on NHS revenues within early stage businesses or kind of, seed stage or slightly later businesses, because of what you just said. Scaling within the NHS is very hard. Would that be fair to say, or would you disagree?
I think it's definitely challenging, right? Because of the long sales cycles and because of the complexity. It's a multi-stakeholder enterprise level consulting type of sale. And so it's difficult because of so many constraints that we have in healthcare in general, right? Which is the sad thing about the industry. But it's interesting when you're a generalist fund like we are, your point of view about sort of playing in health tech versus, say, looking at another fintech deal, it forces really interesting conversations around the table.
Yeah, I quite like to get into that, right? Because I hadn't actually considered that, which is, you're quite literally not comparing apples with apples. You're comparing investment decisions across categories potentially, right? Which I think is really interesting. So again, for anyone listening, and correct me if I'm wrong, Lina, but broadly speaking, like the way that you do your investment decisions, let's say you're a health tech only fund or a healthcare only fund, you're comparing people within a category. So should I invest in this healthcare business or should I invest in this healthcare business, and which one's better and which one's not, and so on and so forth. Whereas actually what you're saying, because you do lots of different things, you're actually stacking up different companies from different sectors against each other, which is kind of a different way to do that investment decision, which I think is really interesting.
Correct. And so much of that, especially back to the early stage, right? So much of that goes back to the founder and the founding team, because how else are you gonna, like you say, compare apples with whatever oranges?
Yeah.
It's difficult because, and I think a lot comes down to actually it's this dimension between going broad and going deep. And actually, as a generalist, I believe that we need to come with a prepared mind, right? We need to know the industry and its constraints and the risks, right? And then assess whether it's on our thesis as an investor. Is that the place we want to play or not, right? And those decisions usually are very interesting because you're bringing people from different fields. And, in the partnership, we have people from, all sorts of different industries with different experiences, different points of view. And so some of those conversations are, we have people that are very bullish about metaverse, and if they could, we would make the whole fund on metaverse. And then we have people, saying, hey, can we look at web 2.5 because we don't think we're web 3.0.
Yeah, we're not quite at 3, but we're more than 2, but we're not quite at 3 yet. So is there like a web 2.6.6 or whatever? Yeah, no, I hear you. So I want to dig more into that, and I think that in the next part of the show we can go into what you said there, which is the investment thesis, which is sort of like the basis upon which you find companies interesting or not interesting, and definitely how that relates to health, because I'm really interested to understand, as a generalist fund, how you even come up with a thesis within health, which itself is like enormous. I mean, there's all kinds of different things that you can do in health. So let's take a quick commercial break now, and then we will be back in 2 minutes with Lina Zakarauskaite. The second time in the show. I think I got it right again. And we will be right back. Principal investor at Stride VC. So yes, back in 2 minutes. Hello and welcome back to this week's episode of HealthTech Hour, live with Lina Zakarauskaite, the principal investor at Stride VC. So before the break of Stride VC, the venture capital fund, before the break, we just started to get into your kind of investment thesis, which again, for those of you listening, that's kind of, well, why didn't you explain what an investment thesis is, seeing as it's your thesis? So I don't know why I'm doing it, but yeah, sorry about that. Please go on.
So we're an early stage venture game, right? Which means that we typically invest in pre-seed, seed, early Series A companies in the tech space across different sectors. We're a generalist fund. So there are certain areas that from the specific portfolio construction point of view, capital, resource, etc., we're not going to play in, which we make very clear upfront. So
like what?
Hardware, pharma, pure pharma, single molecule drugs, the things that are very much, very specialized, binary risk, by empirical risk usually. It's just not.
Right. Not so what you mean? So what you mean is you either can make the drug or you can't. There isn't like a pathway where like if we think you can get to if we think you can build a platform selling something, and there's an upside case where it's this, but there's also a middle case where it's that, and a downside case, it's not binary. You're either going to be crap, okay, or really, really good. That's kind of what you mean?
Correct. And what's really fascinating, actually, which we'll do a little detour and come back, this sort of emergence of tech bio. So we used to say biotech. No, that's outside of our game. Like that's
tech bio.
Very much on the edge. Now you think about, tech bio, and it's kind of a nice term, and, but I think it really does encapsulate this breakthrough that happened in biology as a field in the last 10, 15 years, where we're going from what used to be an empirical science, right? Where you do it, you run your high throughput sequencing, the drug either works or it doesn't. If it doesn't, back to the drawing board, versus where we're moving towards today, which is a much more engineering-like discipline where we can iterate, right? So in startups, we always talk about being agile and iterating and testing and learning, the cycle of, the pace of learning and discovery and experimentation. What's really incredible now, if you take, we take a COVID vaccine as a great example. It used to take 6-7 years for the end-to-end process for a vaccine to be produced. I mean, you'll know better than me about this. Now, because of this amazing, increase in access to the data, the underlying data, the reduction in cost in sequencing, amazing new tools that we have available, we can really turn biology into a much more engineering-like discipline. And that's fascinating. And hence, for us as a fund, actually, it's still very much, an ongoing conversation. But some of that investment thesis, if you want to play in health, and if you want to, if you're looking for the next big frontier, a lot of marketplaces have already been created. A lot of problems have been solved. We need to look beyond, right? That's the game. We're an early stage investor. We need to see what the big emerging trends are. And I think tech bio, for example, is definitely a big one.
Yeah. So last week's show was with Jason Foster, who's the CEO of Ori Biotech. So he's a great guy, and we did a great show on tech bio. I think it's a really interesting area. So if anyone's interested in learning more about tech bio, head to Spotify or YouTube. You can get the show with Jason. I think it's really interesting, like the idea that you can cure cancer. This therapy or CAR T cell therapy can cure cancer, but they just can't make enough of it cheaply enough that everyone can get it. I think is sort of interesting, and like trying to figure out, the challenge isn't about the binary decision about whether the therapy works or not. That's been done. This is now about, can you scale up manufacturing of a highly, highly individualized treatment to a point where the cost comes down low enough that healthcare systems can adopt it at scale, which is, like you say, it's an engineering, manufacturing, operational challenge with a biology sort of filter,
Yeah, and it's interesting. You asked me earlier about the sort of the map of healthcare is so vast.
Massive.
There's so many places to play in, right? Yeah. And especially when you're a small generalist fund that doesn't just do healthcare, it's like, where do you play?
Yeah. And why do one thing and not another thing? Like, how do you even?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. How do you even assess that? And I think it's interesting because if I look at kind of a very simplified version in my head of the health tech map, if you like, we have digital health, right? We have a big trend. I think we have these 3 big trends going on. We touched upon one, which is the sort of the frontier, the translating research into clinical practice. And, Ori Biotech is a great example of that. We can talk about a few more. But on a sort of digital health side, on the consumer patient side, I think what I'm seeing, it's this sort of the existing, at least in Western medicine, structure of the sort of patriarchal doctor is the god, and doctor knows the best. Healthcare model into a much more patient-led approach, where I think because of COVID, I mean, people just got so much more aware and interested in their health, in self-healing. We have digital therapeutics where some of the companies in mental health space that have the promise of helping to deliver therapy without a psychiatrist in the loop, right? A fully sort of automated digital solution, which of course has its own questions, but that's for another time. But we have this sort of putting the patient first and kind of driving the decision. And I think that involves, overlooked conditions, things that chronic health, women's health, long COVID, mental health.
This is one of the things. So when we first started PopDoc, Where so the you know, as people regularly listening will know, but you know, and as we talked about before the show, so it's a smartphone based way to give yourself a quantitative blood test. And when we started the company, a lot of the diagnostics plays were really focused on, let me put something on a lateral flow test that's never been put on a lateral flow test before. So like, okay, I've done a monkeypox lateral flow test, and then suddenly like the next day there's 50 different monkeypox lateral flow tests. Or, you know, I've done H5N1 bird flu on a lateral flow test. And then again, within a week, there's like a gajillion people. We saw this in COVID, you know, like the commoditized, there are so many people in, I would call mainstream lateral flow development, which really is a yes no response, like yes you have it, no you don't. That's like highly commoditized, and as soon as someone can do something, everyone can do something. So but that was where a lot of the diagnostics people were at. Like that was really what the aim of the game was, like novel biomarkers was the cry that we heard all over town. And we really decided to focus on the largest disease areas where access to testing was a problem. And you very quickly realize it's not just access to testing, it's how do you where there's diseases where regular testing, there's a heavy incentive to the system and the patient. Like there's a big payoff if you can regularly test, better health, lower cost, lower number of people going to hospital. And then the final piece is where there's a big so what factor. So if you are testing regularly, then what? Okay, well, it's access to treatment, it's access to digital therapeutics. Like you say, there's like a pathway whereas a lot of those yes, no tests, okay, it's a flu lateral flow test. You got the flu. You stay at home, take a paracetamol. Like what are you going to do? COVID's a bit different, but still now, even with a COVID test, you test positive, you just stay at home. What are you going to do? So anyway, so that was how we thought about it. And we were talking to a lot of people about cardiovascular disease and the 5-marker lipid panel. And cardiovascular disease is the single biggest killer, not just of men, but of women in the world. So whenever you think of, and my co-founder's a woman, she's actually my wife, Kieran, and we've got a third co-founder called Vlad. But anyway, the point is that all of the existing, if you think about like images of people having heart attacks in films, on TV, in adverts, it's always like an older guy that goes down clutching his chest, right? And weirdly, the symptoms associated with women having heart attacks are actually different than men having heart attacks. So with women, it's much more geared around fatigue, low energy, headaches, things like that, than it is around chest pain, arm pain. Anyway, the point is that this whole area, when we started to go out to talk to people, they were like, no, it's not novel. No one cares about cholesterol. No one cares about cardiovascular disease. It's like, this is the single biggest killer of men and women, and no one's really paying attention to this. Now, thank goodness the wheels turned in our favor massively now, and you know, with NHS contracts and all those kind of good things. But it was really interesting for a while. We felt like we were completely insane, you know, like that we were the ones taking the crazy pills. We're like, wait, like it's like if someone has elevated cholesterol, and then therefore through that app they can get an immediate access to a statin prescription, which effectively reduces their risk of having a heart attack to a negligible level, meaning they don't go to hospital. Like you're saying, that's kind of boring and we're not that bothered about it, and like no one really cares because it's more about whether or not you can test for monkeypox. Like, okay, we were like, it took us a while to try and work that through, but you know,
I feel like being seen as the crazy ones, it's a part of the founder journey, right? If you want to be contrarian.
Yeah. They were like, wow, cardiovascular disease, does anyone really care? I'm like, well, it does kill the most people in the world, so I think some people probably care. You know, I think it's kind of a thing, you know. So but to your point, COVID sort of was very helpful to a lot of companies, not just us, but just more around healthcare systems came under so much strain that they realized that because there are very good existing treatments for cardiovascular disease. Like this is not trying to cure obscure types of cancer that are really treatment resistant. The treatments are there, they're ready to go. It's about how can you test enough people to get enough people through that funnel, which I think might appear unsexy, you know, versus doing something, I don't know, different, but it's highly effective.
And it's really interesting because the sort of emergence of this B2C to B as a go model, as a go-to-market strategy, you know, in healthcare in particular, when you're dealing with patient groups that have a really strong, usually unmet need with the tools that exist, it's really, you need the data, right? If we're talked a little bit about selling into NHS, like you need to show that your solution is working, right? But it's a bit of a chicken and an egg, because if you don't have any distribution, well, how are you gonna get there? And so it's sort of at least theoretically, we're seeing a lot of companies actually aiming at this sort of utilizing the kind of the B2C to B approach to really kickstart the cold start problem. Which
that's what Babylon Health did when they first launched, right? Because Ali, who's been on the show as well, another, I mean, I'm not going to take full credit for his success, but he was on the show. And Ali's been super helpful with PocDoc as well. So I'm sure he's not listening, whatever he's doing, but thank you very much, Ali. But that's what they did, right? Because back in the day when they started, which I think was probably like 2011, somewhere in that range. Like, I think that they were getting thrown out of meetings in the NHS when they were talking about digital, video. And they were like, the people were like, no, the patients aren't going to want it. So I think they then did exactly what you said, which was like, let people book private video appointments, and like just then went back with the data being like,
let's see, exactly, let's let the numbers speak. Absolutely. But there's another interesting point which sort of plays into this moving away, I guess, in some extent, which we're seeing. It's so interesting, like when you zoom out, this move from sort of centralized institutions more towards the shifting power to individuals. I think about the data a lot, right? Especially in healthcare. I mean, we have, who owns the medical record? If I get a CT scan, who owns that data and who monetizes that data? And do I get any benefit from that data being sold on my behalf?
Yeah, and so, like I think you'll mean like, because there's loads of, there's tons of companies in the UK and elsewhere that are saying, well, let us analyze your health records and we can help you, the system, make improvements, or our AI model will help you do case finding or diagnosis, and all those people are making money off of your records. It's an interesting question.
Right. And then you look at some of the work that I know blockchain is a loaded topic right now, but you look at the power of the underlying distributed ledger, and you look at the DAO structure, distributed autonomous organizations, and the sort of the value extraction back to the actual end user. I think it's so promising. We're seeing a lot of projects popping up in the space, actually merging this sort of health data and Web3. DeSci is the new fancy term, decentralized science, which includes some of the health tech as well. I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, I think so. Just for everyone listening, how would you describe Web3 or define Web3? Which I don't know if anyone's listening. I mean, it's sort of, in investment circles, it's quite the hot topic. I think it's kind of crossed over a little bit, but might be worth if you want to just define it for everybody.
Probably one of these terms that VCs came up with, sort of made.
Someone came up with it. I don't know. You got to everything has to have a label under the this of this.
It's a new iteration of the web. Let's put it like this. But really, what it is at its core, it's much more than a technological breakthrough in terms of the blockchain technology. It really is about addressing a lot of issues that we have with centralized institutions having centralized power, right? And so Web3 emergence as this movement to take the web actually, in fact, back to its own roots. If you look at the early iterations of the internet, it was created as a tool for scientists actually to share openly public, research and papers. And so it's this movement that encompasses many different industries with the promise of creating a new internet, the better version of the internet.
Yeah. I think that we've got to go for a commercial break in a second, but I do think this decentralization of health data is interesting because it's something that's been talked about for a really, really long time. And, the blockchain has obviously got way, way, way further with finance, right? Like Bitcoin, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not quite sure if it's done too much in health. Maybe it has, and I don't know, but it's definitely a super interesting area. So we are going to be back in 2 minutes for the final part of today's show with Lina Zakarauskaite from Stride VC. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Hello and welcome back to the last part of this week's HealthTech Hour, live with me, Steve Roest, and Lina Zakarauskaite from Stride VC. So before the break, we were kind of talking about decentralization with data, healthcare data. So have you seen, what are the kind of high points of that have you seen, or is it still kind of in its infancy? And I don't know, what have you been looking at, tracking in that space?
I think DSI as a movement it's buzzing, but it's very early, right? So we had a beautiful conference a few weeks ago, DSI London, with people from crypto community, with people from science and academia, with people from the industry. And it really feels, meeting the founders and entrepreneurs, it really feels like there are some great things coming up.
Yeah. It must be quite a good buzz, right? Because everyone probably feels like they're on the edge of the frontier and,
It does. And I think it's fascinating because if we talk about healthcare data as one of the sort of the applications of blockchain technology, the other one is science. If we look at academia, and it's so closely related to health tech. If we look at academia, it's a $1.5 trillion industry globally, with a 60 to 70%, depending on the field, inefficiency rate in the form of reproducibility crisis, right? In other words, this discovery that we realized that so much of the research done in the last decade cannot be verified, cannot be reproduced. And so in other words, it's literally meaningless from the science point of view. What makes science science? The verification.
I'm sorry. Go on, carry on. I talked over you. I'm sorry.
No, all good. I find it absolutely crazy. Why is nobody talking about it? Or in fact,
so I read a book. That in itself is not surprising, but I read a book specifically about. It was called. What was it called? It's called. It was something like is medicine sick, or can medicine be saved, or is medicine too sick? And part of it was can medicine be cured? That was it. It's a great book. And it was about, a large part of it was about this central issue around the quality of academic research in pushing the field of particularly health and medical research in this instance forward. And it kind of came up with similar conclusions, which was and this might be different to what you're going to say, but the point of this book was that there's the very fact of publishing research has become the be all and end all goal, and the monetization and incentives are aligned with publishing at all costs and not moving the fields forward and not generating quality data and not admitting when you don't succeed. It's this kind of perpetuation or perpetual cycle of being required to publish, which is just churning out junk research.
It's such a multifaceted issue. The way academic research is shared, peer-reviewed, published, and ultimately funded, it's broken. The centralized system put in place at the end of World War II it's running its course. It's not sustainable. And these, you put it in a beautiful way. This pressure on the academics, this constant, when the proxy becomes the goal, H-index, amount of, the citations you get in high impact factor journals, when that becomes the goal, well, this is what we end up with. And actually,
some of those journals, right? These people think about it as this. And again, I'd just like to clarify, I've not gone and independently verified this. It's because from a book I read. So, before I get yelled at, like, I'm just being completely open, just sharing what I read. But these journals are owned by publishing companies. And this is like a multi-billion-dollar operation. So they need new content, like any media outlet. They need new content. So they're supporting the fact that this research is coming out and being published. And, then they're complicit in the whole thing because they need to make their numbers.
And what's fascinating? When your demand and supply is the same end user,
Yes.
a
Yes.
researcher.
Yes. They mentioned this. This is yeah, exactly.
Right.
Do you want to expand, because I know what you're going to say, and this is such an insight.
It's look, what I'm going to say is science is fundamental to us as a society. It drives so many of the decisions we make, and publishers and media in a broader sense, and the way research is being shared. I mean, it cascades. We make decisions. That's the job of the governments. We have regulations that is informed by the research that has been published and is cited and distributed. And that comes from the fundamental science. But if that science is not verifiable, 70% of that is not, what does that mean for us as a society?
And also, the buyers of these papers are the people who do the research or fund the research that goes into the papers. So, like, those people are not interested in, at the moment, they're not incentivized to do anything other than continue on, on the hamster wheel, basically.
It is a hamster wheel. And then you look at blockchain, right? And let's put all the hype aside. I'm not talking about a crypto Ponzi scheme, get rich fast, crypto bros. Like that. This is not what it's about.
Worked out well.
Let's look at the actual technology, right? And the underlying science. For science to be reproducible, it has to be fair. What does that stand for? Findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, right? That is fundamental. And then you look at blockchain, and you look at the distributed ledger, and you look at its features like, permissionless, transparent, persistently tracked, and indexed on chain. It's like a match made in heaven. It makes sense.
So in your vision, or in this kind of, not your vision, the vision, so to speak, you would want a kind of a migration of scientific research to be sort of published on the blockchain? Is that where this sort of goes?
I think that's the way forward. This reproducibility crisis, it is a crisis. It's not just a term we use. It really is. It's bad.
Yeah, I mean, like like 70%. The whole point of publishing, or used to be, right? Like you said, is that you put your results out there. Like this happens in physics all the time, right? Where like theoretical physics, where they're like, I don't know about this completely, but this is kind of what I got. Now it's over to the crowd to try and see whether I'm right or wrong, because this stuff is so out there. I'm not completely sure, but over you go, sort of thing, right? Whereas, like, if in other places, then if that's not being possible, then that sort of really undermines the value of the whole crowd.
I think as I said, I think it's a systemic challenge, and so we need these sort of very ambitious projects actually that have an aim of redesigning an entire industry. It's not just publishing, it's not just peer review, it's also the way we share research. Today it's a PDF, it's a manuscript, it's a piece of work that a scientist work on for 2-3 years, right?
Yes.
With kind of the end goal of the beautiful narrative, the big breakthrough that nature is gonna publish. And but what about all the incremental? In technology, we always talk about incremental innovation and the power of these quick iteration cycles. And in fact, the composability, back to my fair, interoperable, being able to build on each other's research. And we have these silos today. If the way you're being judged or evaluated as an academic is through the amount of citations you get, well, you will want to protect your IP. So we have the same groups, of people.
It's about incentives, right? Like if you as an academic, it's not like academics in the grand scheme. I mean, look, they're all doing fine, right? It's kind of like a job for life, unless you totally, go off the reservation and they get paid good money. But it's not like, not like Elon Musk money, So like they're if they have incentives to maintain their position or get promoted or to build their team or and a lot of academic positions are based around finding research funding. So they need to go out and find their own funding. And one of the decisions around who gets funded is, guess what? How big of academic you are, how many times you've been cited in the field, like how many, all of those type of scores. So it's all the incentives are just misaligned. It's not
Exactly.
necessarily the fault of the academics. They're just in the system at this point.
I completely agree. And I actually really believe that open science, there's been a couple of attempts to kind of bring open science to life. And it really feels like the sort of DeSci movement has this promise of redesigning the technology layer, but also, as you rightfully pointed out, the incentive system too, because they go hand in hand. We need both. We need both. It's what's really interesting and kind of takes me back to where do you play as a generalist fund within health tech, and what is health tech, how far do you take it? I look at some frontier things. I look at translating research. There's so much incredible research that's been done, even though a lot of it is irreproducible, sadly. There is a lot of amazing work out there, and in so many fields, so little has actually been translated into clinical practice. And I mean, take mental health as an example. We have amazing breakthroughs in computational neuroscience when it comes to evaluating evaluating and treating mental disorders. And I think more of this sort of translation from a scientist and an entrepreneur, you think of the archetypes, they look very different, right, for most of the people. Actually, I think the more we can bridge this gap, the less kind of the cool entrepreneurs, it's all about sales and big kind of pitches and being out there. Like, it doesn't have to be that way. There isn't one way.
I agree. I mean, I do think I don't really know altogether too much about the US academic scene, but I know quite a bit about the UK scene. And, there aren't that many universities, and even within the universities that are good at this, there's not that many academics that are actually ended up getting sort of spun out, right? So even at outside of like a handful, there aren't that many spin outs coming out of universities that in theory have academics doing highly technical research, right? That is applicable in the real world. And therefore, where does it end up going? Where's the so what factor on it?
Exactly. And I think it's fascinating to, even if we're able to translate a small percentage of some of the incredible findings that, big breakthroughs in different fields, computational genomics, neuroscience, we talked about biotech. There's so much happening. Actually, there's so much that has been done in the last decade. And so that's the frontier I'm excited about when I think about health tech. When I think about health tech, to me, it really is the intersection of healthcare and technology, right?
Yes, that's it. Yes, you've cracked it.
Right? That gets me going. I'm excited about that.
So I've got one more question, and then we're going to have to end the show. So I wanted to ask about what's your feelings. There is quite a lot generally written for those people listening that follow in the space around the potential lack of diversity within venture capital and within startups, at female founder, female CEO, female investor. Have you seen any? What's your view generally on that whole area?
I mean, being a young Lithuanian investor in London, it's as an industry, I think we need to do better. It's a challenge in tech. It's a challenge in finance. Things are getting better. There are amazing incentives, initiatives of getting women in tech and women in VC, and these great initiatives, great projects to help and change the status quo. But I do believe that in a small way, we are helping to create the future of us as a society. And the society is, it's diverse.
Yeah.
And so the more people in the decision-making power that can really help and drive these conversations and look at these problems from different angles and provide different points of view based on their personal experience, based on the background, based on, many different things altogether. I think that's what venture capital, at the end of the day, it's a simple business. It's about the quality of your decision making, right? It's the bets that we place. And so the more I think diversity we bring into that, the better I think we all do actually as a collective.
I would agree with that. That's a great moment to end the show. Lina, principal at Stride VC, thank you very much for coming on the show. And thank you very much to everyone listening. We'll be back again next week. Thank you.
Thank you.